Welcome everybody to the 2021 Trendall Lecture, the 9th annual Trendall Lecture from the Trendall Research Centre at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gillian Shepherd and I'm the Director of the Trendall Research Centre. Once again, for our lecture this year, we are using an online format. In the past, before coronavirus, we've met at some venue in Melbourne and enjoyed some drinks and nibbles after the lecture. I very much hope, though, that you have equipped yourselves with a beverage and some snacks. Certainly here in Melbourne, it's definitely the cocktail hour. But of course, the great advantage of this online format is that people who couldn't normally be in Melbourne can now join in and listen to the lecture. And many of us are, of course, scattered across Australia. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'd also like to extend a very special welcome to those of you who are outside Australia, particularly if you've got up very early in the morning or at some other unsociable hour in whatever time zone you're in. I know, for example, a lot of people who booked for this lecture are in fact in the Northern Hemisphere, so that's wonderful. But I'd like to extend an extra special welcome to those of you who are joining us from New Zealand. Our speaker, of course, Anne Mackay, is beaming in from New Zealand, but the New Zealand element is particularly appropriate for the Trendall lecture because, of course, Dale Trendall, who was the founder of the Trendall Research Centre, was himself a New Zealander. He spent almost all of his adult life in Australia, but he was born in 1909 in New Zealand. He grew up in Auckland and he studied classics at the University of Otago. And from there, he went on to Cambridge and then on to his work and life in Australia and, of course, Italy. Now, just before I introduce our speaker properly, a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this lecture for those who can't attend, especially because of those time differences, but all the registered attendees will receive a link to the lecture recording in the next week or so. Now, remember though, you don't have to worry because this is a webinar format. Only the speakers can be seen. So you don't need to worry that you will appear in the recording in any way if you're concerned about that. There will also be the chance to ask some questions after the lecture, and I hope you will have some. I'm sure you will. It's going to be fascinating. So please do type any questions or comments you have into the Q&A function. Just as you think of them, you can do that during the lecture and we'll get through as many as possible. Anyway, let's get going. It's a great pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Anne Mackay, who is in Auckland right now. We're very sorry we can't be entertaining Anne in Melbourne, but we'll do that another time. Throughout a long academic career in several countries, Anne's primary research field has been ancient Greek vase painting, and especially the work of the innovative painter and potter in the black figure technique, Exekias. And in 2010, she published the definitive monograph on Exekias's work. He was working in Athens in the second half of the 6th century BC. Anne's also edited 2 volumes on oral theory, which attest to her other interest in this area. And in this area, she's also contributed comparisons between narrative techniques of early oral-derived epic and the black figure tradition of archaic Greece. And was Professor of Classics at the then University of Natal in Durban in South Africa before her appointment in 2001 as Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Auckland. And she's recently retired and now holds an honorary research fellowship in classics at Auckland University. And we're absolutely delighted that she is able to speak to us today. So now I'd like to ask Anne to share her screen and tell us all about the vase-painter's palette, the significance of colour and texture in ancient Greek vase painting. Thank you very much, Anne.
Right, can you please confirm that you can see that? Good. Well, thank you, Gillian, for that really nice introduction. It's a real honour to be invited to deliver the 9th Trendall lecture, hosted by the Trendall Centre at the La Trobe University, and I'm really grateful to Gillian for that invitation, and also for her work in setting it up as a Zoom event. Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge Diana Heatherich for making sure that all the technicalities of a remote presentation work. I do appreciate that. It's perhaps a bit ironic under these virtual circumstances that I'm going to explore a hypothesis tonight about black figure vase painting that has developed over many years of my enjoying direct hands-on access to quite a large number of vases around the world. My deep appreciation, by the way, for the generosity of many museum curators who made this access possible in the past. Now, of course, there is increasing interest in and reliance on the advances of virtual reality. Now, virtual reality is a superb means of remote access for teaching and research, saving the planet from many plane trips and saving vases from excess handling. However useful as it is, it does not have the same immediacy as person-to-vase encounters. The light source, for one thing, is fixed, and while one can manipulate the vase, the effect is somehow, I don't know, rather flat, despite the virtual 3D, and it's not the same as being able to move oneself around the vase, resulting in an almost infinite variability of light, vase, and self in combination. It's only under such circumstances that one can begin to see the different surfaces in a painted scene. I'm going to focus almost exclusively on black figure vases in this lecture because that is where the colour effects that I shall be discussing first developed and are most clearly manifested. A couple of disclaimers though to start with. I found this topic very challenging to support in a PowerPoint because my hypothesis is derived from a vast number of small details in many scenes by many different painters. And I shall therefore be looking in detail at just a few chosen instances. I hope it's not going to be too chaotic, therefore. I'm going to start with the vase that first provoked my curiosity about colour and texture effects in black figure. Everyone knows Exekios's Vatican Amphora. I thought I did, but ... It was my first experience with a real masterpiece, although I grew up, so to speak, studying in the Logie collection at the University of Canterbury, and though they have some wonderful vases, not quite of the standard of Exekios. And so one couldn't wish for a better experience than to be handed that vase by one of the museum staff as he closed the case, having got it out for me. I nearly dropped it, not quite. The impact was immediate, the brilliant colour, the detailed incision, and on the obverse, the sheer size and majesty of those figures. Photographs, of course, can't hope to do justice, and so I'm not going to rave on any more about that aspect, but bear it in mind. There's very little added colour in this vase. The body armour over the warriors' chests, there we go, was once a brilliant white, here and here, representing their protective corselets of padded linen. Added red appears on their helmet crests, headbands, and a tiny touch on the garment across Aias's back leg there, although not on his nearer thigh. An interesting little anomaly that might perhaps make a bit more sense later on. Exekios' intricate detail of incision, particularly on the men's cloaks, creates a persuasive and almost palpable sense of the texture of an ornately patterned fabric. It's in keeping with this to see that the satyr's face on Achilles' shield here is depicted as projecting out in relief from the surface of the shield. In this masterpiece, Exekius was clearly reaching for something more than a mere application of black gloss to the smooth surface of an amphora. And indeed, he achieved it by means of a new development in black figure, an innovation he created himself. A relief effect on Aias's curls through the application prior to painting of tiny spirals and spots of extra clay. This rare technique, as Beth Cohen has remarked, involves both the potter and the painter in close collaboration, and so was probably realistically practicable only when these two were one and the same, as indeed with Exekius, who signed this very vase in both capacities. There's a similar effect for Leda on the other side. She shows up better, I think, in the black and white photo, but you can see that her hair too is in relief, a different kind of relief, showing a kind of ringlety effect, and also across the top of the head. It's useful, I think, to compare cori of the same period, and here we have the peplos cori of about the same date as the Vatican amphora. Really, one can see that Exekius, with his relief effect, was striving for realism, for a realistic effect, the actual 3D effect with that hair. Now here's a section of a vase where the added colours are really well preserved. The white has not flaked off, as it so often does, and in the raking light, it's not an ideal photo, but it does actually show the contrast between the high gloss of the black and the matte surface of both the added red and the added white. White is used for the woman's flesh and also for the little dots along the borders of her peplos at the overfold and the neck. Additionally, little dot rosettes on Hermes' chlamys. You can see there and there the ghosts of what was once probably quite a bright, sparkling white. Here's a detail from another vase where you can see that the added colours were not always the same hue. Added red can vary from almost purple to russet, and white from, shall we say, Purcell white to cream. The old man's age is designated by his bald pate and the white hair and beard, but here the white has partly worn off, leaving just a ghost of his beard. The application of white in these two instances can be seen as representing the natural hue, more or less. The old man's hair is quite appropriately white, and women, although they're rarely as white as ivory, except in literature, the idea that they would be paler than men is well established. Inside, they lived. Outside, they were veiled, although this is probably not true of the lower classes. It was, of course, the upper classes who presumably enjoyed the vases, along with the Etruscans who buried them. Also, pale skin for women is documented as signalling feminine desirability from Homeric epic on. One thinks of white-armed Hera, white-armed Helen, and so on. But here, I think, we have to acknowledge that vase painting colours are all a matter of convention. Ancient Athenian garments were certainly not black, even if they might have been sometimes striped. Men were likely to be darker in colour than the women who worked indoors and went out veiled, but they were not per se coal black. Working with archaic Greek vases, we quickly become used to this simple gender coding, white for women, black for men, to the point where we cease to notice it consciously. This is in keeping with the symmetrical depiction of the eyes, almond-shaped for women, round with corners for men, always frontal despite being set in a profile face. These little things, I think, after a very short time studying vases, we just simply stop noticing. So, taking account of many of these and many other conventionalized aspects of painters' repertoire, black figure painting we have to recognize as being systematically conventionalized in every aspect, and thus effectively it conveyed layers of additional meaning that fell well within the contemporary viewer's expectations. Over the years, therefore, I've been pursuing the idea that color, too, which is often applied in ways that do not match the hues of reality, might equally, in some respects at least, be a matter of a systematized convention in terms of what is actually signified by the application. So here's my hypothesis up front, which offers 4 categories. I'm not going to read them out, you can read those for yourself, but you can see that I'm going to be concentrating on colors that represent what one knows to be that color, colors that represent something colorful, but who knows what color, something to do with the way light falls on the real item reflected in painting, and something that represents a difference of texture. To test these categories, initially, I'm going to look at the general distribution of added colors in several scenes before comparing color application in several different types of depicted object, alongside what we know of the real object in life, ancient life, where possible. So, to start, the color is well preserved on this neck amphora by Exekias. I'm going to be showing a lot of Exekias slides, by the way, partly because they're just wonderful, partly because I have quite a lot of quite good photographs of them, unsurprisingly. Where I'm showing the application of color and commenting on it as a general principle, I've taken care that I'm not misrepresenting the general nature of the use of color across black figure. It's only in the techniques that I particularly identify as innovations that it will be peculiar to Exekias. And I will be using other painters as well as we go along. Now, if we look at the color on this amphora, first we notice that the edge of the lid is painted red, added red. And this seems to have been used not only on this vase, on other vases as well, because on a real object, vases being real objects, the added red along a particular part of it, this is going to make more sense later, seems to mark a different section of an element that's on a different angle to the rest. You'll see when we come to armor particularly what I mean by this. There's also red lines on the foot, on the knob, and these too seem almost like catching reflections of the light on the bright glossy surface of the black. I'm not going to comment more on that, however. There are some touches of red in the subsidiary decoration, in the lotus and palmette frieze on the neck of the vase, little dots neatly scattered across it. Here is another of the Exekias neck amphorae, an earlier one this time, and you can see that there's a bit of variation in the amount of red and the location of it. This is purely for the sake of variation. I think the red here is simply to highlight an otherwise perhaps rather mundane representation of stylized lotuses and palmettes. Brighten them up a bit. I think it's no more than that when we're looking at this kind of subsidiary ornamentation. Moving now, though, to the scene. This is of a chariot procession with a kithara player in the middle. I'm not going to comment on identifying the scenes that I'm talking about, by the way. Some of them are vexed questions, and it's not really relevant to the use of color here. The added colour distribution here is fairly typical of what you find in other chariot scenes. The added white is quite evenly spread across the scene, a bit lacking on the right-hand side, but generally there's a sort of sense of balance about it. It identifies the women, and also one of the 4 horses harnessed to the chariot is painted white. This is quite regular in chariot scenes. It doesn't seem intended as a signal, by the way, that the horse in question is a mare. I've striven to find out about this, and there's just no strong evidence. But I think it's rather a visual aid to distinguishing the 4 overlapping animals. If they're all painted black, you get an awful lot of legs, for instance. Hard to tell which belongs to which. This horse and the women both have red eyes for contrast with the white. Partly, I think this is because the eye is painted in over the white. The black probably wouldn't stick to the white, the red does, both being matte. And you do need a contrast. To reserve the eye and leave the underlying black showing would be quite a technical demand, and why bother when you can paint it red? The white horse, by the way, is almost always the near pole horse, so second in from the front plane. So there is a kind of pattern of usage there as well. The 3 males in the scene have white motifs on their drapery. The musician's kithara is one of the main reasons, however, why I selected this scene. It's interesting, and there are many parallels for this in other scenes that involve a kithara player. It has a black sounding box with white arms extending from it upwards. These are marked by being white as a separate part. As I think you can see in this experimental replica that was on show in a special exhibition in Berlin. The base here is wood, as surely it was in antiquity, with different materials, in this case horn, for the arms. Probably they were faced with ivory originally, but of course that's not acceptable now. There's red on the clothing in the scene, on the man's beard, on the wreaths that the characters wear, and the mane of one horse. The others have incised hairs individually marked in. And I'll come back to this later, along with the man's beard and the painting of hair red on some figures, not here. Red breastbands for horses are a regular feature. I'll comment on that later, what the significance is. And you might be able to make out little white pendant lotus ornaments hung along the lower edge of it. For a different subject, here's an earlier vase from a member of Group E, the wider workshop associated with Exekias. Of course, it's not up to the precision that characterizes the master, but you can see that the same practices are followed. White again for the women. The old man has his white hair. Never, by the way, do you find white-haired old women, because women are never shown as old in archaic Greek art. What I take to be bread on the table is white. The ornament on the symposium couch, white. And this will be inlaid, the same as the facing of the kithara, probably in antiquity with ivory, which would naturally be white. There are no intact examples of such a couch preserved, but we do have evidence of ivory inlays on furniture, for instance, at Vergina from Philip's tomb, a bit later. The boss on the shield is painted white. The motifs on garments, the dots along Hector's shield rim there, as his body lies, his armor piled up beside it. And then we turn to red. The woman's whole peplos painted red. These are all important points that I will be picking up at a slightly later stage. The inner veil of her himation, the mattress patterning, Priam's stripy garment, Achilles' shield rim there, the whole shield of Hector, the band on both the helmets, one of Achilles, the other of Hector, and the hair and beard of both Achilles and Hector. What depictive intention could possibly unite all of these? They're often referred to as highlights, but I believe that this term is truly misleading for many of the instances. They're not highlights. It conveys more than that, as you'll see. And we turn now to a proper battle scene in order to exemplify the general application with armor and weaponry. The shield interior view over here is red with a white armband. Again, I'm going to be commenting on these particulars at a later point. The exterior, here and here, of the two shields have white devices, and on this one, Memnon's, there is also an incised gorgoneon in the center with white teeth. Teeth are white. What else would you use? There is red on Achilles' breastplate. Similarly, not here but there, on Hector's, Antilochus's rather, over the abdomen, under the rib cage. The crest of the fallen warrior's helmet is red with white ends. The combatants' greaves have white dots around them, and red is variously applied en masse and as motifs. Touches of red even on the wings of the bird. Also, all the other applications, women and so on, noted in previous scenes. So far then, what patterns begin to emerge from this wearying array of diverse details, and apologies for all that? White, for elements that are white or whitish. Consistently, women's flesh, old men's hair, bread, inlaid ivory, thick linen corselets. Similarly, although I'm not illustrating it, ship sails. They are always white. It's important to recognize, though, that white can stand for merely pale as well as snow white. White horses do, of course, occur in nature, but not to the extent of 25%, as one in almost all teams of 4 on vases. This is a conventional use, even though it is not unnatural to find a white horse. Animals' teeth, as I pointed out with the Gorgon's teeth there, including the teeth of Heracles' lion's skin even, are white. Horses often have a white blaze on the forehead, as in nature. So most significant areas of white signal more or less an actual hue. Is this progress? It's what you'd expect. However, white dots on clothing, in rows along borders or as ornamental motifs, the rosettes, on clothing, what colour might they be in reality? It's perhaps indicative of their indeterminacy that in red figure, motifs are painted for clothing on the reserved ground in black, so black motifs on the natural orange colour of the clay in the figure's reserved silhouettes. In sculpture, remains of colour would suggest a variety of hues for decoration on clothing. As for red, we've seen it used in clothing where it's not impossible that hue might be the intent, and on arms and armour where hue would be improbable. Added red presents a much more complex set of applications than added white, and so for the next part of this lecture, as we look at more specific details in the various categories, there will be more of an emphasis on red applications than white. We've seen that white marks things that are naturally pale. Note here, as the white linen corselet, you get a very well-preserved example here of what I said was missing, for instance, on Ezekiel's Vatican amphora. Also the white shield, a bit flaked off, presumably to give the carrion-eating dog, bit of a warning there, a stark impact. But my main reason for selecting this scene is to demonstrate not the white, but the red. Not surprisingly, the red that flows, gushes from the wound inflicted here by Menelaus on poor Amasis, follower of Memnon the Ethiopian, is represented in added red. There is also red on the armour, but the blood is the main point here. I'll come back to armour in the next scene. Back to another of Ezekiel's neck amphorae. Again, blood pours from poor Penthesileia's neck, spurts out over her arm. Added red, most effectively used. It looks a brighter colour there. I think it's the same colour as here, just not over black, but over the natural clay colour. On the clothing here, you can see the red stripes are coinciding almost exactly with the incised lines marking the folds. This doesn't seem very realistic, that an ancient garment would be neatly pleated along its stripes of colour. Might this possibly be a conventional way of indicating the alternations of brightness and shadow in cloth that is gathered in folds? This possibility needs confirming parallels from other uses, and I shall point those out in a few minutes, hopefully then nailing this suggestion. Penthesileia's helmet has little red dots, I don't know if you can make them out, along the incised ornamental whorls and spirals. These are like the white dots on garment borders and clearly ornamental, but since the helmet is evidently contoured, the red dots may perhaps indicate rows of raised patterning in the bronze. The rim of the helmet at her neck is red. It emphasizes the rim here as offset, outturned, which for me is reminiscent of the red edge on the lid of the New York amphora that I commented on before. And there are many other red stripes on rims and edges of vases. The inner surface of both shields is red. It's an interesting foreshortened view that we get here. And you see a touch of white there for the palmette end of the armband attachment inside it. Shields were, of course, lined with fabric or leather, as otherwise they would have become unbearably hot in the sun on the battlefield. This lining may have been red in hue, of course, but also the interior, as represented here, would be in shadow because of the concavity. However, as you will see, red shield interiors are by no means uncommon, even when potentially not in shadow. And so it may be the actual colour of the lining, it may be the material of which the lining is made, leather for instance, or shadowing effect. There are other details. Penthesileia's scabbard has diagonal red stripes. There. It would be made of leather, and as we will see with horse harness parts and chariot sections, leather is often depicted as red. Both helmet crests have a red outer edge. I'll reserve comment on this until later. On Achilles' breastplate, there is a fine red line following the incised spirals over the pectorals, and also an inverted V over the diaphragm. This application of red is a much subtler version of the thicker red lines that regularly occur along the pectoral spirals on breastplates, as you see there. When we look at an actual breastplate from the battle spoils dedicated at Olympia, Achilles' markings become easier to understand. They relate to the stylized mouldings of the pectoral muscles and diaphragm below the lower edge of the rib cage. On the right, you can see much more clearly what is very finely expressed on the left there, an earlier amphora by Exekias. On the real breastplate, these mouldings probably made it more comfortable to wear, conforming to the body shape beneath. Since the curvature there is accentuated by sharply defined ridges, for instance, here under the pectoral muscle, a slight shadow is created, even as the swelling bulge catches the light. Imagine it in action on the battlefield, flashing and catching the light. And so there is a logic to the vase painter's combination of incised spiral for the ridge and the red spiral that follows it, although I'm not sure that I would care to determine whether the red here represents the flashing of light on the bulge or the shadow beneath it. I do incline towards the latter, but I'm not sure that it matters in this particular case. The point is to mark the difference in the way the light falls on the item. We get some reinforcement from the Munich cup. Forgive the composite photograph here. I wanted to show the color and I had to join two of my details together. The shields alternate black and red. For variation, as with the horses, one being white, it makes it just a little bit clearer to see who is wielding which weapon, which piece of armor, and so on. Likewise with the greaves and the helmets. The breastplate here on the forward man is in side view, but you can see the same sort of effect with the red shadowing, as it were, the incised spiral for the pectoral muscle. Although here there are tiny white dots in the center and along there just for added effect. These may represent perhaps raised dot ornament on real bronze. There are white dots also around the helmets and the greaves, as well as for motifs on the clothing. Are these white dots basically the same in what they represent on the clothing and on the metal? Clothing one would expect to have a woven pattern of motifs, or perhaps embroidered. While, as we shall see, on the armor items, the dots do seem to have a functional reference. I'm just flicking this splendid scene as a whole past your eyes because we're going to be looking at excerpted details from it. One point to note here in passing is the use of added red for the hair of all the figures except for the two old men separating the two warrior brawlers. The main point of interest here is the two shields with a concave interior painted red and a convex exterior, respectively. First, the exterior with the white scorpion blazon. The rims of the shields are often painted red, or if the shield is red, they may be left black. As you see here, from the shield shell dedicated at Olympia in the middle there, shield rims are offset and so catch the light differently. They may also be patterned, as here on the right. These raised spots, by the way, are the kind of detail that I was thinking of earlier for the red dots on the spirals of Penthesileia's helmet. Light and pattern, two good reasons to mark the angled rim as distinct from the convex shield in vase painting. Perhaps either light or pattern, perhaps both might apply. Then there is the question of the shield blazons, which can be quite fanciful on vases, depicted by incision and or added red and white. We know from actual shields at Olympia that emblems could be added separately in applique, and so it's logical that they would often be depicted in white like other additional elements on items, such as inlaid ivory or the little danglums on horse breastbands. We have here a winged gorgoneon, also from elsewhere, a boar. Now for the interior of the shield from that Munich vase here. Once again, the interior is depicted in red and the construction is well represented, as you can see from the example from Olympia. The armbands were separate attachments and their straps above and below the actual loop for the arm were divided into little rectangles with scenes in relief. While on the Munich vase this detail is actually represented by incision, there, more commonly the armbands were painted white in vase scenes. Once again, white for something that is a separate attachment, whether or not it was white in practice. Of course, with a shield band, it's bronze, same colour as the shield. As we turn now to helmets, another detail from Exekias's eye cup in Munich, the white dots around the eye holes along the neck edges of all the helmets find parallels in real helmets, as here in the Athens National Museum, where there is a row of studs that really catch the light. Some are missing, leaving just their holes, and one can surmise that the studs might have had a function beyond mere ornament. The helmets must have been lined, like the shields, to avoid contact between hot metal and human skin, and it must have been attached somehow, stitched or riveted. Furthermore, many helmets on vases have a line marking off the crown. Sometimes this is incised, sometimes also or instead marked in with red, as in these two examples. Some Corinthian-style helmets, which you see examples of there, have the crown offset from the lower portions, with a sharply distinguished ridge that creates a little shadow beneath it. Here, the red definitely seems to indicate shadow, which offers support for the interpretations of concave shield interiors, the spirals on breastplates, and also perhaps the red striped folds of drapery. You'll have noticed that greaves, to guard the shins, are sometimes black, sometimes red. The red is visually useful, as on the Munich cup, in making the greave clearly separate from the black of the leg that wears it, as well as from other greaves overlapping. And this may have been the primary motivation. Like bronze breastplates and helmets, however, the shiny metal of greaves must have flashed in the sunlight, which might also account for their being marked with red. There are some careful painters, like Exekias, who include an interesting detail on some greaves, a moulding over the kneecap here. This is not a face in the majority of cases, although it can look like one, and some actual greaves do have a gorgoneon, but generally it is a moulding in imitation of the form of the kneecap and surrounding muscles, like the pectoral muscle mouldings on breastplates. If a painter takes the trouble to actually depict this, I do think we should take seriously his application of colour as well. That here the red is carefully not applied to the kneecap moulding suggests that the latter is being marked as something other, as you see in the real examples. The moulded area has here, highlights and shadows, and so it is possible, probable even, that this was what the painter had in his mind's eye. If the greave was red, the moulding would naturally have to be left black to show the different light effect. Some painters applied added red motifs on their greaves, spirals and swooshes, and once again this too can find a parallel in museum items. The one you see there was dedicated at Olympia and has the row of tiny holes around the perimeter clearly visible, just as the painters regularly depict them in white. As with the helmet, this was for the fastening of an inner lining to cushion the bronze and protect the leg within from heat as well as enemy blows. Whether rivets or stitching, it would constitute a separate added element, and hence the dots would logically be white in keeping with all the other added separate elements painted white. A quick look now at clothing. Painters competent with the graving tool, like Exekius, often incised women's peploi with incised squares containing tiny motifs, like that worn by Leda on the left. This is suggestive of a woven pattern. However, a peplos that was actually red in hue in its entirety, as represented here, was quite possible. We see that from Phrasiclea, one of the chori that preserves original colour indications, albeit faded. The flowery motifs here look whitish on the red peplos, but could have been another colour, any other colour. Other chori preserve vestiges of quite a wide colour range. Llewellyn-Jones' recent paper provides convenient excerpts from the fragmentary records at the sanctuary of Artemis Brauronia on the Acropolis of Athens, and these record details of garments dedicated to the goddess by women. They specify red or purple garments, some that are patterned all over, some in other colours. One of the favourite colours is frog-coloured, don't you love it? Or yellow, or blue-grey. Garments with contrasting borders. There are also numerous references in literature to brightly coloured and flowered garments. Poikilos is an adjective used, and also the combined anthropoikilos. It seems flower brilliant. Poikilos, multicoloured, like a kaleidoscope. Those are the connotations. So it really does suggest a lot of colour, a lot of ornamentation. It seems likely, therefore, that in black figure, added white ornamentation on clothing on vases should be regarded as representing a contrasting colour, but unspecified. Again, I remind you, in red figure, these clothing motifs are painted in black on the reserved figure. So there again, in the reversal, black would stand for any colour, a colour, colourfulness generally. Stripes are intriguing in clothing, particularly since they coincide with incised fold lines so consistently. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I do want to draw your attention to the consistency with which the incised line and the red patches coincide, also to the white line that you see here. That for me is a bit of an anomaly. I can't account for it. It occurs in a few paintings by a few not very good vase painters working around 530 BC, and if anybody's got any bright ideas about that, I'd love to hear from them. In dealing with animals, although there's a wide variety of animals and birds depicted, the use of colour is again very restrained and I think readily accounted for. I'm resisting talking about colour on birds generally, with the exception of depictions of cockfighting. Fighting cocks on the whole were enlivened and differentiated with added red. But the Clearson painter here put a lot more effort into trying to capture the gorgeous colours of a fighting cock. Still, his palette only allowed added red and added white, and so although he achieved a very vivid result, even for the hens to either side of the two cocks, he was obliged perforce to make his two additional colours stand for a whole range of others, including, of course, the iridescence. Animals were similarly enlivened. A lion's mane is an obvious distinction from its hide. The bull's red neck, surprising perhaps when you look at it here, but bulls do tend to be quite shaggy around the neck. And so hair seems to be the contrast that is marked as different from the animal's normal hide. Sometimes, not here, there are red arcs along the incised ones on the animal's hindquarters, and I think the photo of the actual bull would justify this with the shadowed effect underlying the muscle there, although naturally it's all very stylized on the vases. When it comes to horses, the manes and tails are a major locus of colour-related attention. They can be black, as on the right there, with or without incised hair indications, or they can be red, as in the hydria on the left, in various combinations, often with incised fringing on the underside. What is being marked in these cases with the added red? Different colour, perhaps. If it's a bay horse, that would make sense, but not all horses have these dark points. A chestnut, for instance, is fairly uniform in colour. I've come to the conclusion that it's most likely to indicate the painter's awareness of textural difference. The mane and tail are much coarser hair than the hide, and longer and flowing in the wind, so also, of course, catching the light. The colour, then, would be largely immaterial. It does seem significant that warriors' helmet crests, which were of horsehair, no examples, alas, survive, were painted with added red about as often as horse manes and horse tails. Sometimes the red is a stripe along the outer edge of the crest, perhaps representing the effect of the bristling ends of the hairs held erect in the crest holder. Sometimes one has a similar effect on a horse's mane, just a stripe, which again might suggest a bristling hogged mane, for instance. The breastbands of chariot horses are almost always red. The red here is undoubtedly indicative of leather and is in contrast with the horse's hide. In contrast to the red leather breastband, white danglems are quite often represented. I've commented on these before. They're often quite hard to make out, but in a raking light you can see their ghost. Also, there's a clearer version of that. The cushion, where the yoke rests on the withers of the pole horses, is very often red. This would be made of leather, like the breastbands, and so fits again that same pattern. Leather, as we can identify it, tends to be shown as red. Was it red? Probably not. So far, white for hue and added bits on clothing, etc., no matter what colour, red for hue and changes in light effects, and especially distinguishing shadow from highlight. But there is one more important colour effect not yet discussed, and that is coral red. The first instance of it is in the tondo of Exekius' famous Dionysus cup in Munich. Unusual to find the whole tondo decorated, and it is so much more vivid with the intensified, dark, corally red that you see there. That is not a trick of the camera. It really is that deep colour. What, one must ask, is the visual purpose of this? Dionysus' boat floats in the middle of the sea. We know that, there's dolphins there. The sea here is a very intense red, but the Mediterranean, and especially the Aegean, is, of course, regularly characterized by its very intense blue. It seems inescapable, therefore, that coral red in this instance was to stand for the deep blue of the sea. The only other use of coral red in a black figure cup is by Psyax in a cup in St. Petersburg, where again the entire tondo is painted, and the exterior as well is decorated in coral red. The purpose in this case is, of course, not the intensity of the sea, although certainly it rejoices in the vivid effect. The figures seem to float without frame or ground line in a bright, ethereal realm at a remove from ordinary mortal experience. And I'm paraphrasing Beth Cohen's reaction to this cup in a publication a few years back. And perhaps this effect might also apply to the wonderfully evocative Exekius depiction of Dionysus, the sense of an ethereal elsewhereness that is brighter somehow than real life. But, of course, in that case, also a sea realm. Coral red is shiny. Added red and white are matte, especially the added red, with a different texture, as you've seen, from the black glass. One can almost sense the driving desire, especially on the part of the most innovative painters, such as Exekias, to find a means of achieving a more effective impression of reality. This drive manifests in a traceable trajectory in regard to men's hair on vases. As you've seen, it was often painted red in black figure, in contrast to women's hair, which was always black. Perhaps men's hair was more unruly, textured. The hair of Heracles I have found particularly helpful and significant in this respect. Heracles was regularly depicted with very curly short hair. In group E, as here, he has red hair, but with a scalloped profile on top of his head to show the curliness. On an early vase, Exekias replicates this, but in black, maybe preferring to concentrate on that truly magnificent Nemean lion's mane. Later, Exekias translates this into relief curls. You can almost sense the frustration that led first to incised and then to relief. Then it was imitated in red figure by the Andokides painter as raised dots in relief. Then in black figure, the Lysipides painter imitates Exekias with incised curls, while on the other side of the same vase, the Andokides painter tries for a simplified relief effect in his red figure. On yet another red figure vase, his effect is essentially the same as Exekias's. The idea of relief was then taken up by later red figure painters, the pioneer school, and after, in many different contexts, and sometimes gilt was added for extra special effect. But that would be another lecture. Where one finds relief used in black figure, there is notably less added red and added white, which I think adds just a little to my hypothesis. And this, I think, is a good point at which to end, hoping that the heroic strength of Heracles here will provide valuable support to my theory about the signification of added colours in black figure painting. I propose that in addition to literal hue, the added colours can variously stand for an unspecified contrasting colour or a variation in the way light falls onto different parts of an item. They can mark parts of an object that are made of a different substance, and they can represent significant distinctions of texture, made more visually persuasive by the contrast of the matte surface of the added colour against the shiny gloss of the black figure silhouettes. The one thing that I think we can be sure of is that colours were not received by viewers only in terms of hue, whether they be added red and white, or the black and red of the fired clay, or the coral red that was such a special effect. Thank you.
And thank you so much for an absolutely amazing lecture. Unfortunately, we can't hear or see the audience, but I know they are all applauding like crazy. Please, everybody, do put comments, appreciation, and especially questions into the chat or into the Q&A. I, for one, am never going to look at these vases in the same way again, and that was just quite extraordinary. It just opens up this whole new world, and I was certainly completely convinced. It reminded me of when I was working at University of Birmingham in England, where we had a little museum there, and we had a there was a wild goat style Rhodian a cup there, quite broad, with a Greek meander pattern around the rim, which had quite obviously been painted to look three-dimensional with white highlights, I think, and always viewed this as perhaps imitating some sort of raised relief on perhaps a metal vase, but you have taken this one whole step further, I think, and really brought out the three-dimensionality of these vases. And in fact, I'm just seeing some amazing comments coming up in the chat. I might read some of them. From Sally, thank you for opening my eyes to the details. And actually, we'll add to that. I really absolutely agree, as you say, looking at these things on screen or virtually, it's never the same as handling those things. But your images are just absolutely amazing. So I think even in this medium, we've got a fabulous view of it. I've got a question here from Anna, who thanks you very much, who asks, could you please comment on the added yellow on black figure? Did you study it in the same way as added white and added red?
It's not very common at all. And I wonder if the added yellow isn't in fact yellowed white, because the creamy color, I mean, I showed you the distinction at the beginning between the Persol white and the cream white by the same painter on two vases found in the same tomb, in fact, so produced around the same time. And I think that, I mean, that was just one set of variations. The white can be really quite yellowed. Technically, this is achieved by adding a little bit of black gloss to the white clay, which constitutes the added white, to sort of tone it down a little bit. The best example of this, I think, is on an Amazonomachy, where one living Amazon is carrying the dead body of another, and the living one has bright white flesh, and the dead body draped over her shoulder has a sort of dirty beige colored flesh. And very clearly, this painter, I can't offhand remember who it was, is deliberately trying to capture the sense that this is a real corpse. And yeah, I think that for me is the most striking example of the variations of different colors. I've concentrated here obviously on the white and the red because it's so prevalent. But clearly, if they're choosing to dilute or otherwise change the particular tinge, it's probably for good reason. Depends on the example.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I must say, I would love the reference to the somebody who works on burial customs, to the corpse one, because it would go nicely, I think, with the very rare depictions of a body being lowered into a coffin or the grave as well. That would be wonderful. Now, I've got a comment and a question from Liz, who says, first of all, thank you so much for a great paper, Anne. The concept of the red and white on clothing and armour representing an interplay between light and dark rather than being about real colours is fascinating, especially the red representing shadow or darkness is reminiscent of Homer's wine dark sea. Yes, absolutely. Appropriate for the Dionysus cup too. And then she asks, also as a matter of interest, how long did the tradition of relief as invented by Exekius last in vase decorating?
Oh, the best place to find out all about that is Beth Cohen's wonderful catalogue from an exhibition that was in New York in the early 2000s, entitled The Colours of Clay, Special Techniques in Vase Production. That's not the exact title. Hang on, I can probably... Special Techniques in Athenian Vases. I've got it actually sitting here right beside me. And Beth looks at relief in particular and shows how it was produced through both black figure and red figure. Now, in a more recent article, and there I cannot give you the details, but if you really want them, please contact me and I can give them to you. She discusses, in comparison with much later artworks, not just vase painting, the use of relief for special effects. In Christian religious art, for instance, a medallion might be painted, but in relief on somebody's chest to bring it out and actually create the real shadows instead of painting the real shadows. In vase painting, we find it through red figure on special vases. There's relief, for instance, in the famous Penthesilea cup by the Penthesilea painter, and Kirsch vases have relief. So yeah, it becomes increasingly common, but still special, only on special vases. I think because precisely of the point I made that if you're adding clay, it's the potter who presumably does that. But if he's to know where to put the added clay, the painter must already have made his sketch of the figure. And so you've got a real combination there. And then, of course, with the added clay applied and a little bit dried, the painter can paint over with the black gloss substance. But you can see why it would be much easier for a potter painter to do that rather than for the painter to go to the potter and say, "Oi, would you mind adding a bit of clay here and here and here because then I can paint it?" You know, doesn't sound practical.
I have a comment and also a question from Alexander Heinemann, who I know is coming to us from Tübingen in Germany. So hello, Alexander. First of all, thank you for a beautiful paper, rich in fantastic photographs. I have seen dozens and dozens of new details on pieces I believed I to know well. You've shown most convincingly the extent to which black figure painters use colours in order to imply, amongst other things, the way light falls on particular offset surfaces. In other words, to imply an object's three-dimensionality. I'm aware I'm putting this rather broadly, but I'm wondering whether the increased use of actual foreshortening in subsequent red figure painting led to painters somehow turning away from the late 6th century conventions of this, as it were, polychromous spatiality. This would also dovetail with your observation on relief paint being used in place of added colour. Now, that is a very interesting question.
Well, I think it's a comment more than a question. I would certainly agree with it. Yeah, the foreshortening in black figure, of course, it's only really for shields and chariot wheels, which are shown rather awkwardly foreshortened. Although that example by Exekius is just incredible with the inside bit of the shield showing. In red figure, yes, it becomes much more prevalent. And I guess once you start experimenting with almost the beginnings of a perspectival effect, you don't need these encoded systems anymore because you can actually capture it otherwise. Also, I think what struck me when I was putting this talk together was that no matter how much you make a system out of using added red for shadows and so on, there's no way in black figure that you can represent chiaroscuro, for instance. And that, of course, you do find coming in the 5th century, particularly with white ground painting towards the end of the 5th century. But also, I think there are some examples of it in red figure. So again, there are different techniques that red figure lends itself to more than black figure ever can. And so the old-fashioned codes, I think, then start to fall away in favor of the more illusionistic way of painting.
Doesn't it? We have another question from Bronwyn, who I believe is in Japan. I must say we have the most amazing audience tonight. Who says, "Thank you, Dr. Mackay. That was brilliant. I was particularly struck by the coral red backgrounds that you showed and that they remind me of Japanese lacquer work. I'm going to attempt to pronounce urashinori, that uses gold, white, black, and red. Plates and trays in particular occur with red backgrounds. Have you considered looking into the conventions used in the similar limited palette of urashi as a parallel for the black and red figure Greek vases?"
Ooh, simple answer, no. But it's certainly something that I would like to look at. Julian, am I going to get to see these comments? Because I would like to see that word written down.
Right, yes. Look, I'm hoping Diana, could we, I don't know if Diana, perhaps, who's our wonderful tech person, can somehow capture them, because I'm hoping you can also see all the amazing compliments that are coming in. But Bronwyn has just put in the chat. I can send it to you with some resources later if you would like. So
Yes,
thank
please.
you, Bronwyn. We could have that as well. Thank you very much, Bronwyn.
Yes, you will get the recording of the chat and the questions.
Good, thanks.
Okay, now we've got one from, now here's somebody from John Holdham from New Zealand, Mount Albert. Were these colours put on as glazes with the lower temperature ones going on last? I too will be able to look at these things in a new light. Thanks for a great talk.
Well, good question. Of course, I'm sure, as you know, it's a single firing process in 3 stages. There is a lot of discussion of this, not to do with the added red and added white, which seems simply to have been slathered on and popped into the kiln, and they took their chances there. And these, of course, were the only 2 colours that could survive the firing process. But these questions arise with the coral red. And here I would definitely urge consultation of Beth Cohen's work, not only on relief, but also on coral red, where she has looked in huge detail at how the coral red was applied. Now in Exekias, I think it might be, let me see if I can just, share this with you. There, you should be able to see it now. Can you? Yep, okay. And I'll try to, no, I was hoping to be able to blow it up, but I've lost my controls, unfortunately. No, okay. Where there is incision, for instance, in the grapevines, in the bunches of grapes, you can see that the coral red has been painted around the black. So the pattern here is that the black gloss was applied, probably then also the added red and white. Then the red, coral red was applied around the black, and then the incision was applied. Now in the sea arcs, Beth has noticed that underlying the incision, one can see the coral red. And so in this case, it was applied as a proper ground before the black was painted over it. So this difference in technique has been related to the possibly slightly different firing temperatures required by the coral red and the black. I haven't actually pursued that in further detail than noting, gosh, that's interesting, and thinking I'll follow it up at some later stage. But I would definitely urge consultation of Cohen's work there.
Thank you. We have another question here. This is from Elizabeth, who I know is in Melbourne. Hello, Elizabeth, who I think is asking the question we all want to know the answer to. She says, thank you for your wonderful insight into the use of the colours, and it was a joy to see so many magnificent vases in such fine detail. I have one small question. What colour would frog coloured be?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, presumably green. Although, when I was reading that in Llewellyn Jones's recent article, I too thought, well, we've got frogs out in the garden, and some of them are brownish, and some of them are greenish, and some of them are bright, bright, bright emerald, sort of jewel green. But then I read further, and he points out, sorry, you're getting the proper answer to this, a technical answer, that most of the colours would have been plant-based colours, which would not have withstood very much wear and tear. Let them out in the sun, they'll fade. Wash them more than once and they'll probably fade as well. And he points out that most clothing in ancient Athens was either natural fibre colour, you know, unbleached wool or something, or probably rather dirty colours, dull colours. So frog colour presumably is a sort of greenish, brownish, beigey. On the other hand, look at it the other way. Garments that were dedicated to Artemis were the pick of the bunch, the best. Think of Hera looking out a really fine robe for Athena in the Iliad, for instance. So if something's frog-coloured, it's unlikely to be terribly dingy. It's presumably, while it's still new and bright and pretty. So answer, therefore, to the question, I don't know, but probably brighter rather than duller and in a froggy green sort of colour. Wonderful.
Well, we'll go for a really nice green, not a sort of gunge colour. I think would be good for it, yes. Yes, and I think this reminds us all of the significance of textiles in antiquity and how much we are missing in that regard, especially. It's a fascinating area. We've got just time, I think, for 2 more questions. Another one from John. The little dots along the edges of armour could be silver-bearing rivets, which would have been a lot easier to deform to hold a lining in place in the tin bronze body of the armour. Any thoughts on that?
Wonderful. I'd looked at them and thought, surely they wouldn't use silver for that. It presumably would be a bit precious. On the other hand, to know that it would be, yes, of course it would be more easily deformed and therefore more useful. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think, I'm trying to, actually, when I put up that photo of the actual helmet with the studs in it, I was trying to remember, were they bronze, were they something else? And I just can't remember. And it's a long way to Athens to go back and have a look.
But an excellent excuse for going there when you get the chance. Yes,
Yes.
Yeah, I have to say, I had not ever noticed those studs around Penthesilaios' helmet before on the Executive vase. It's quite extraordinary. Okay, well, just one last question then, and then we must really let you off the hook. From Denise, who says, Dr. Mackay, thank you for a wonderful lecture. Is it likely that the shiny coral red of an object would react differently to a matte red or black when the bowl was filled with liquid?
Well, the most obvious example to discuss this is, of course, the Dionysus cup. And I've wished that I could persuade the museum staff in Munich to let me fill it with wine and drink from it. But oddly enough, they're probably not very easily persuaded. But I think one can imagine that, for instance, the white of the sail, and since I've still got it up, let's actually look at the thing. The white of the sail would gleam through, I think, the wine. It depends on how.
Oh, I think, I'm sorry, I think we're looking at your text, not the image there.
Text. Sorry?
Text of your lecture. Yeah.
Oh, how weird. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yes. And now I can't. Oh, yeah, there we go. That's funny. It was.
These things behave very badly, these multiple screens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that now looking more like?
Yes, they were looking at the Dionysus cup again. Yep, with the same.
Okay,
Yep.
no, that's good. Yeah, so I think, it's easy to imagine if you sort of put a mental filter across that. Were they drinking red wine? Were they drinking white wine? Question. Let's not go there. But let's put a sort of rosé filter across it, as it were. The white sail is going to shine through that. The darker parts will sink a little from the immediate awareness. And so I rather suspect that the ship will really almost come upright and seem to be traveling across the sea. And of course, if you move the cup, then there's going to be little ripples and sloshes and so on, and it will really seem quite lively. So I think, I'm quite sure this is an intentional effect here. but is also a most unusual cup. So I don't think one can generalize from that particular extraordinarily innovative and creative piece to other pieces. Whether one would see much of the psiarchs there, I don't know. Next question, were these really outstanding pieces ever actually intended for use in a symposium? They turn up in graves, mostly in Etruria. Some show signs of wear and tear, but not all. We just don't know.
And again, one could think of the white ground lacquer, of course, that appear to have been made largely for funerary use because they were not really dishwasher proof, as it were. Yeah. That wouldn't work at all. But yes, such an interesting point you make there about the that interplay between the actual wine and the image on the vessel. And of course, you see that in quite a lot of vases. Craters, for example, have little scenes going around the rim that would be sort of floating on the waves of the wine or whatever. And one of my favorite ones, the one of the man throwing on the tonda of the cup, the man throwing up in the street after the symposium, and the courtesan who is holding his head, and you think of that as you drink and the wine goes down in the cup, the revelation of what's going to happen to you on the way home from the symposium.
Or what on earth have you been drinking?
Drinking, yes, exactly. Fantastic. Dana, I might just ask you to stop your share now because
sorry, yes.
Yep, that's that's fine, because we've just got just to end, and again, thank you so much, but we just have a final slide, which I think Diana will share, just to remind everybody, here it comes, okay, thank you. Just to thank everybody, in particular you, Anne, but just to say to everybody, if you've enjoyed this and you are interested in future Trendall Centre events and you're not already a friend of the Trendall Centre, but you'd like to find out a bit more of it, please do join us via the link you can see on this screen, or you can just Google Trendall Centre to find our webpage and into the link. It's free to join, and we'd absolutely love to keep in touch with everybody. And now that we are all into Zoom, I think we must really do more of this online stuff, even though the world is now starting to get back to some normality. Of course, everybody can't always make it to Melbourne. And I guess an upside to the sort of horrendous past 2 years the world has had is that we have learned new ways of doing things, and some of them are worth sticking with, I think, as well. And this sort of thing is one of them. I would like to thank Diana Heatherich again for all her help, tremendous support. It's very reassuring to have somebody sorting out the back end of all this, especially when we're global, really, across the world with this. And finally, one more very heartfelt thank you to Anne for an absolutely fascinating talk that I think has really, from the comments, changed the way everybody will look at vases again. This format, as I said earlier, doesn't allow everybody to show their appreciation in the normal way, but as we've seen from the chat, it is definitely out there. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending. Stay safe and well. All the best for the holiday season and 2022. And we hope to see you again next year, but goodbye for now. Thank you.